Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Steve Wenzel. I'm the Executive Director of the Gordon Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government. I want to welcome all of you here tonight for the forum. The Gordon Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government was created in 1989 by then President Sally Inney of Central Lakes College, and it was formed to preserve the legacy of Senator Gordon Rosenmeier. Senator Rosenmeier was the single most powerful, the most influential, and the most respected legislator in all of Minnesota history, according to every Minnesota historian that I have read about on that issue. It is appropriate for the Rosenmeier Center to sponsor this forum tonight with the two speakers on the topic of copper, nickel mining, and environmentalism, because as many of you know, Senator Rosenmeier was the chief author of the legislation that created the Pollution Control Agency in 1967. Minnesota was the first state in the nation to do so, and all of the other 49 states followed Minnesota's lead on this issue thanks to Gordon Rosenmeier. When Nixon became president in 1969, he assigned two individuals, top individuals on his staff, John Ehrlichman and William Ruckelshaus, to create legislation to establish a national environmental protection agency. And he recommended that they follow the Minnesota model, which was the only one of its kind at the time in the entire country. President Nixon signed the EPA legislation into law in 1970. Rosenmeier worked to create an environmentally regulatory body such as the Pollution Control Agency to make sure projects in Minnesota are done right. He never would have approached these regulations as a way to say no to investment and job creation. He wanted to set up parameters for groups investing in Minnesota to get to yes, responsibly so, in order to make certain we were mining or harvesting in a way that was respectful of a clean environment and for a clean environment. It is now my privilege to introduce to you Laura Radeke, our board member, who will introduce our two speakers tonight. Thank you, Laura.
Minnesota has committed to 100% clean energy by 2040, and the U.S. has committed to tripling clean energy infrastructure by 2030. While our current energy systems depend upon fossil fuels, clean energy infrastructure depends on minerals and metals, such as we find in northern Minnesota. However, northern Minnesota is also the home of plentiful and pristine water. And copper-nickel mining's long history of water pollution and environmental damage creates a controversy that will be discussed at this forum. How do we navigate, as a society, these conflicting concerns? The Rosenmeier Center is pleased to have with us tonight two of Minnesota's most knowledgeable presenters on this topic, Julie Lucas, Executive Director of Mining Minnesota, Kathryn Hoffman, Chief Executive Director of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. To learn more about them, please read their bios in your program. Julie Lucas will present first, followed by Kathryn Hoffman. At the conclusion of the two presentations, there will be a time for questions from the audience. If you want to ask a short question, please raise your hand and someone will come by with a microphone. Keeping your questions as short as possible will allow time for more questions and it will allow more time for the answers. And now please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Julie Lucas.
I got too click happy. I'm here tonight not because I loved mining growing up, not because I understood what natural resources did for us, but honestly, I'm here tonight because of organizations like the one that's going next. I'm here tonight because of people like Kathryn. And I want to point that out because sometimes in these debates, controversies people call them, we lose sight of a lot of issues. And I don't want us to do that. I'm here tonight because I love water. I love water. These are all photos I've taken, all of places near someplace I call home. I grew up partly in Duluth, then we moved down to Barnum Moose Lake, then I moved back to Duluth for college, then I moved to the Iron Range. And these are all places I've called home at some time. I worry about these water resources. When we have these discussions about mining, sometimes we lose sight of what we think mining opponents are doing or saying, and we lose sight of the fact that they are concerned about destroying these water resources, and they are advocating that we don't. I love these places, and I love that people fight for them. My choice to fight for these water resources took me a different path. I graduated with my master's in water resources science from the University of Minnesota Duluth in 2002, and I moved to the Iron Range. Not to work in mining. That was definitely not in the plan. Instead, I was going to teach biology at a community college, just like this one, Mesabi Range in Virginia. I think I just heard a boo. That was great. And I didn't know anything about mining. Having grown up in Barnum and Duluth, we didn't have mining. To me, mining was just destruction. And it was these weird-looking piles and hills on the Iron Range that were shaped like wedding cakes. And they were big pit lakes with huge cliffs, and they were just trucks, and they were just stuff. They were just mining. It took me several years before I realized that those holes in the ground, those stockpiles that I saw, those tailings basins, were creating my life and everything I had in it. It took time. But that fear never went away. So when I went to work in mining, my job in mining was environmental. I was the environmental manager of one of the taconite mines for over a decade. And I went to work for one of the proposed copper nickel mines as the director of water resources. I never lost my love of water. I never lost my love of protecting water and applying science to it. The only difference is that I wanted to work in the industry. I wanted to sit at the table, make decisions, and make things better because mining scared me. The stories I read about the Berkeley pit and the stories I read about just the environmental disasters that had been happening, I did not want to keep happening. But I also knew at the end of the day that I used these products. And I really wrestled with it. And for years if I sat on a plane and someone said, "What do you do for a living?" I do environmental work in northern Minnesota. Oh, that's really important. The environment's really important. What do you do? I work in mining. You work in what? Mining. Because I knew how people would respond. And at some point, I got really frustrated and angry with that because I would look and I would see their cell phone. I would look and I would see their wedding rings. I would look and I would see jewelry and zippers and stuff that came from a hole in the ground somewhere. And it was tough because people don't always make that connection. People don't always see people like me who are trying from the inside to make things better. Because mining's not inherently good nor bad. Mining is, and what it is what we make it. What it is are the regulations we put around it. What it is are the watchdogs who watch the watchers. Mining is the people that work within it and the decisions that are made. because we're always going to need mining. We're always going to need these products. We haven't hit a point of recycling yet, but we will. But through it all, we can't lose sight of this water. And so when people bring up their concerns about mining, we have to listen, because water is critical to our lives, and clean water, it's not something everyone has around this globe. We have to be, these are all within 3 hours, folks. Do you realize how amazing this is? People would kill to have these resources. People would also kill to have these resources. And these are all resources we have in Minnesota. Not everyone does. 2 billion years ago, we got our iron. 2 billion years ago, the Earth experienced the great oxidation event. And over years and years of oxygen finally hitting our oceans, we precipitated out our iron, and we got the Iron Range. We also got our manganese. That was part of that whole oxidation event as well. And then we got this whole slew of other things 1 billion years ago, when our continent thought it'd be a good idea to tear itself apart, the mid-continent rift, and thankfully it stopped, or we'd be sitting in an ocean right now. But volcanic activity brought up copper, nickel, cobalt, platinum, palladium, gold, silver. And we have all these minerals in Minnesota, but we also have all this water. And those two things can seem like they're in conflict, and they are. Because you can't just mine willy-nilly when you have some of the most pristine, amazing water resources in your state. You can't run without regulations. You can't do like they used to do in the old days. But you also have to ask, where are we going to get these from? Geologically and geographically, these metals aren't just located everywhere in the globe. Sometimes they're located in dry areas, and then we have problems with water scarcity. And then we have problems with impacting the little water that's there, or even being able to process some of this. These are all things we need to wrestle with. And I want us to wrestle with this. I have wrestled with this for 20 years that I've worked in mining. How do we provide without causing irreparable damage? We are consumers. We are driving this demand. This is just my little nerdy map of where things are located. You folks are located somewhere around here. I'm located way the heck up north. I live in a little town called Side Lake. We have McCarthy Beach State Park. I love to brag about it because it's amazing. But just to the south of me is the Mesabi Iron Range. Just to the east of me is the Duluth Complex. All in one state, all in one region. This clicker is really, just Kathryn, this is my warning, the clicker is very sensitive. Why do we mine? Why are we even here tonight? 20 years ago, I started working on the proposed New Range project. It was PolyMet at the time. And 20 years ago, nobody was really talking about energy transition. We were talking about metals. We were talking about climate change, but we weren't setting goals of tripling renewable energy capacity by 2030, and we definitely didn't have 100% clean energy by 2040. But we still knew we needed those metals. We knew we needed the nickel for stainless steel. We knew we needed the copper, because copper will carry electricity from any source. Copper is energy agnostic. It will carry if it's from nuclear, if it's from coal, if it's from natural gas, if it's from wind or solar. Copper doesn't care. Copper carries electricity. So we already knew we needed these metals years ago. But in recent years, our state and our nation have made really significant goals for an energy transition. This thing is so sensitive. Apparently so is the microphone. Sorry for that. What's the connection? It's hard probably for folks to see, but at the top of this graph is natural gas, at the bottom is offshore wind, and every bar in there are metals. Clean energy requires a lot of metals. And once we get this infrastructure in place, we won't need to keep feeding it. That's one of the important things to understand is we won't forever need to build these systems, but right now we don't have them. In Minnesota, we are actually one of the leaders. We already have a lot of renewable energy, but not every state does, and definitely not every nation, and almost 1 billion people in this world don't even have any electricity at all. So where will that copper come from? Where will that nickel come from? The manganese, cobalt, chromium, molybdenum, silicon, all of those things that build it, where will it come from? Wow, I am trying really hard not to. Where will we generate electricity from, and how will we carry it? Right now, we have coal-burning power plants. We have natural gas plants. We have some wind farms, some solar farms, some nuclear. But as we transition away and we close coal-fired power plants, as we close those, we're going to create new sources of generation. How does that electricity get to our homes? Transmission lines. The International Energy Agency estimates that we will have to double as a globe our number of transmission lines. I can't even fathom that as a Minnesotan because I feel like every highway I drive on is covered with transmission lines. Transmission lines made of copper, aluminum. And why? Because we need to power our homes and we need to power our vehicles. You don't have to raise your hand, but a decent amount of you probably drove an EV here tonight. Electric car on the bottom, conventional car on the top. Everyone's heard it. It's probably become just redundant to your ears at this point. Electric vehicles require a lot of metals. 6 times as much. Right now, Minnesota has somewhere around 1% electric vehicles. If we want to raise those numbers, what are we building it with? Where are those metals coming from? Our goal ultimately needs to be recycling. We need to mine to get us to a point, but every bit of metal that comes from the ground, we have to get better at bringing it and keeping it into circulation. It's only 2024. Humans are going to be around, knock on wood, a long time. The metals, we're not getting new sources. We're already looking at things like deep sea mining and moon mining and asteroid mining and mining in areas that aren't necessarily the best geopolitically. So any metals that we do bring into the system, we have to keep in the system. So when people talk about the need to recycle, yes, we need to get behind those efforts. My husband's on night shift this week. He's a steel worker in one of the taconite mines. He's been there almost a decade now. His job is not easy, nor is it always fun. But every 18 hours, he knows that a train leaves with taconite pellets, and those taconite pellets grow up to become steel. Working at a taconite mine was easily one of the coolest things I've ever done in my life. Because at the end of the day, you knew you created something. And steel is one of the most recycled metals in the world. And every time we recycle steel, all I think is what we are doing is we are respecting the workers, like my husband, that brought them out of the ground, brought that steel into being. We're respecting the earth that we sliced open to take the rock from. We're respecting the water that had to be moved. We're respecting the water that had to be treated. We're respecting the air that had to go through air pollution control equipment. Every time we recycle, we respect the people and the places that that rock came from. I swear I am not trying to click this as fast. We need to talk about environmental protection, though. As I said, a mine is slicing the world open. You can have open pit, or you can have underground. I always compare underground to when I had my shoulder surgery done years ago, and I just have 3 tiny little scars, and you would have no idea I had shoulder surgery. Open pit is a little more obvious. We know that. No matter how we mine, no matter where we mine around the world, there's a hole in the ground. It's one of the reasons that we need to think about our consumption and think about how we conserve and think about how we can use less. But we're still using. In Minnesota and the US, we have regulations. And some may say they haven't been enforced properly, and then I would say, then what do we do to make sure they are? I love where I live, but I also love lights. I also love a warm home. I love being able to hop in my car and come down here tonight. I love a lot of creature comforts, and somewhere there is a hole in the ground for every single creature comfort I have. I want to think that everything I have in my life came from a place with regulations, but I'd be lying to myself. I know that. I need to probably be more responsible with my consumerism. Chances are right now I am wearing clothing that was from a country not in North America. Chances are that I probably don't want to know the source. But with mining in Minnesota, we have a chance to know the source. As we build clean energy, we have a chance to know how it was sourced, at least a little piece of it. You know, just like Minnesota going 100% clean energy by 2040, will it really have a huge impact on climate change? Will it solve climate change? Probably not, but we have to do our part. We're not going to say, you know what, these other states, these other countries aren't doing anything, so we're not either. We don't do that. We say, we're going to do our part. And mining in Minnesota makes us uncomfortable, and it should, because we are consumers who are asking the earth to provide for us. We should feel slightly uncomfortable with that. But we should look at it and say, how can we do it? How can we play our part, and how can we play it responsibly? How can we have the right labor standards, the right health and safety standards, the right environmental standards? Because we can provide at least our portion. Not every state can do that. Not every consumer can do that. We have that opportunity. I knew I was going to do that. We have agencies, and if those agencies we don't feel like have enough teeth to hold companies accountable, let's fix their teeth. Because here's the problem, as I see it. We can say no to mining in Minnesota, but we never say no to products coming in. Every day, trucks drive past these signs from places throughout the US. Every day, ships come into the Duluth port carrying windmill blades, not from the US. We never feel a hiccup in our lives when we say no to mining in Minnesota. Never. Trucks will keep sailing past these signs. All we will have done is ask someone else to bear our burden for our consumerism. I don't feel good about that. And I know we have a solution through. It's finding a way to say yes that meets all those environmental protections, that protects that water I love, but also provides. Thank you for your time tonight.
The very sensitive one. Thank you. Good evening. I'm going to fix my microphone so it doesn't fall off. My name is Kathryn Hoffman. I'm the CEO of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. Are we getting some feedback, or is that just me? No? Yes? Maybe? Okay, better now. Okay, cool. Matt is doing his job back there on AV. That's awesome. All right, so thank you, first of all, to the Rosenmeier Forum for hosting this important conversation. The last time I was here was 2014, also talking about mining, although my organization, MCEA, works on lots of different issues. It was also the last time that I was able to persuade someone from the mining industry to walk on the stage with me. It's been very hard to have these conversations, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and I'm glad that Julie's here tonight. So excited about all this. So here's what I want to do with my time. I want to tell you a little bit about my organization, just so you know who we are. I want to talk about some of the risks of sulfide mining in Minnesota and some of the ways that we are falling short as a state to try to prevent those risks. And then I want to talk about some solutions to clean energy beyond mining that Minnesotans can prioritize. So that's what I'm going to do. All right, so first, who is MCEA? The Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy is a nonprofit legal organization. We're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. We were founded in 1974. And we were founded by a group of Sierra Club volunteers who said, you know what, the industry is hiring these great lawyers. The environment should have great lawyers too. And that was the vision. Since then, we've grown quite a lot, but the mission remains the same. I started as a staff attorney with the organization and started working on sulfide mining as an issue in 2010, and then became the director in 2017. And I actually grew up in Michigan, spending a lot of time on Lake Superior. We have my family has a cabin up there, and that's where I really love to learn the outdoors and clean water, learn to love the outdoors and clean water. And even though I call Minnesota home now, I love that Lake Superior is sort of a unifying theme between the state where I grew up and the state that I live today. So let's talk a little bit about the risks of sulfide mining. Some of this may be familiar to you. This is a conversation I think we've been having as a state for a while now, but I think it's important to understand the key points. Oh yeah, there it goes. All right, so first, sulfide mining and the risks of pollution are different than iron mining. And specifically, the waste from sulfide mining is far more likely to become acidic. And that can cause major problems for plants, for animals, for people living downstream. And if that happens, that acidity, one thing that it does is it creates a higher risk of heavy metals leaching out of the site. So if you have a mining site, there's probably some arsenic, there's mercury, there's certainly copper in the waste rock. And once it becomes acidic, all of those heavy metals are going to come out of the site or leach out of that rock at a higher rate. So the risks here are higher. Second, the risks of pollution from these sites can last for hundreds or even thousands of years. There are hundreds of Superfund sites. These are polluted sites around the country, and they were formerly mining sites. And those need to be maintained, but in many cases cannot be cleaned up because we don't know how. And what that means is that it's likely that somebody, and here in Minnesota, it would probably be the state, will have to be responsible for these sites, perhaps forever. And that's a tremendous risk to the state as well as to taxpayers. A third risk is tailings dam disasters. So if the mine uses a tailings dam, and what that means is they're storing the leftover waste from the processing mixed with water behind a dam. Not all mines use this strategy, but some do. Most of our taconite mines do here in Minnesota. That dam can collapse. That can cause death and destruction downstream. A collapse of a mine dam in Brazil in 2019, which is where this picture is from, killed over 200 miners who were working that day. And the river that's downstream is still polluted to this day. It has not been cleaned up. So you see, these risks are not hypothetical, they are not far-fetched. And in fact, we do not have a single example of a sulfide mine that has operated and closed without causing pollution, not one anywhere in the world. What's more, the track record of Minnesota should be even more concerning. We don't have a sulfide mine here in Minnesota, but the first one was permitted in 2018. Julie mentioned it in her talk. It's called the PolyMet or the NorthMet proposal. They're now calling themselves New Range. It's near Hoyt Lakes, Minnesota, and it would have been our first sulfide mine if it had been built. It was proposed to be an open pit mine, and it does propose to use the type of tailings dam that collapsed here. So it got its permit 6 years ago. Why hasn't it been built? Well, the answer is simple. The mining company has lost legal challenge after legal challenge. The courts have told this company clearly and unequivocally over and over that their proposal does not meet the law. And our Minnesota state agencies did not do a good job making sure that that mine was safe. Let me just pause here. Julie asked a really good question in her presentation, which is how do we make sure that these rules are followed? And the answer, if it's not the state, is it's organizations like mine. And so when this mine received its permit and we saw problems, we saw places where the law was not being followed, we saw shortcuts, that's when we brought legal action. And the outcome, well, let me tell you about it. All right, so in order to move forward, mining companies need to get a variety of permits from all of those agencies that Julie had up on the screen. So one of those permits is called a permit to mine, and this comes from the Department of Natural Resources. And in this case, the court took away their permit to mine because they couldn't show that their project would prevent water pollution, either to the surface water or to the groundwater. And in particular, the court was concerned about the way in which PolyMet was proposing to store its mine waste. It sent that issue back to the DNR for further proceedings, and also concerned about the immediate issue of the groundwater underneath the site. They also lost their wetlands permit. This is a federal permit because the federal agency determined that no matter what requirements or controls the mining company could put in place, they could not guarantee that that mine wouldn't pollute the downstream waters of the tribal reservation belonging to the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. They said there is no strategy that we can put in place, no requirements that would be protective of that reservation's waters. They also lost their water quality permit because our state agency not only ignored but actively hid concerns about the permit from the federal government. And this is a big one because I think we think of our government here in Minnesota as being effective from a regulatory perspective and being trustworthy, and this is a very concerning thing that happened. Our state agency actually asked the federal government to keep their comments away from the public. A deputy director in court of the Pollution Control Agency testified that the state wanted to keep those EPA concerns from the public because it would result in bad press for the PolyMet proposal. And the EPA's concerns were not small, they were big. The EPA thought that the permit would not protect clean water, would not comply with the Clean Water Act, and that the permit didn't have the right standards in place. And most concerning at all, may not even be enforceable in the event that water pollution happened, meaning that there would be no repercussions for the company if there was water pollution. And so here, on top of a troubled industry with a poor track record, we also have little evidence that the state of Minnesota is capable of managing this industry. So let's turn to the second piece. The industry, commonly talks about the need for mining in the way that Julie has done here tonight. The metals are a key piece of the clean energy transition. We need them for solar panels, transmission lines, and electric vehicles. That the demand for these metals will skyrocket due to increased need from the clean energy transition, and that the mines will provide the metals to build them, and that further, that we should build those in the United States because they will be damaging if they're built elsewhere. And let me say first, and this is important, there is much that we agree on here. Climate change is a crisis. It's urgent. Clean energy and electric vehicles are part of the solution. These transitions are happening already and are likely inevitable to some degree, and that's a good thing. However, it's also important to know that this idea that the metals are going to come from somewhere, that mining is inevitable, and that we should pit Minnesotans against other countries by saying, hey, we're going to have to do it here, or we'll do it worse somewhere else. That's a mining company frame that we should all reject. The question that you should be asking isn't, do we mine here or do we mine somewhere else? Rest assured, mining companies will do both and more anywhere they can. Heck, they're going to the moon and to the asteroids, right? Because mining is a profitable business. And the track record shows that many, if not all, of those mines will pollute. I don't know about the ones on the moon, but all of the ones on Earth. So let's start with the right question. The right question, I think, is how do we find the metals that we need for the clean energy transition in the least damaging ways possible? Let me repeat that. How do we find the metals that we need for the clean energy transition in the least damaging ways possible? How do we do it in a way that protects communities from mining pollution everywhere? Addressing the climate crisis should lift all boats. Everyone should benefit from lowering greenhouse gases, and lower income countries should benefit the most because they're most harmed by it. So how do we do it in a way that doesn't sacrifice our clean water or their clean water in the process? Well, I have a few concrete suggestions. All right, so first, and I think this is one that we agree on, I'm going to propose 4 alternative strategies, all right? So the first one is recycling and reuse. We have mined a lot of metals already, and a lot of those are not being recycled. So the United States recycles only 33% of its copper right now. The EU, for example, recycles 60%. We send over 1 billion pounds of non-ferrous metals to landfills every year. We need policy structures in place to ensure that we are maximizing recycling and reduction of metals use. I think we have agreement on this one. All right, second, material substitution. So where all of the metals are being demanded right now, for example, transmission lines or electric vehicles, there are more abundant materials that can be substituted in where metals are limited. So a really great example is right here in Minnesota. We're doing work on iron-air batteries for grid storage. So battery on the grid stores power, and then it allows that power to be accessed, that electricity, at times of high demand. And so that uses materials that are already plentiful, right? Iron here in Minnesota, and it can replace other more challenging materials such as nickel or cobalt. Other alternative strategies that companies are already looking at include lithium ion phosphate, sodium ion, and aluminum ion batteries. All of these show promise in the electric vehicle market with a lot of benefits. These are just battery-related examples. Copper demand has actually been declining for decades, and that's because we've shifted away. We've done material substitution in buildings, for example, instead of using copper pipes, more of the PEX piping, or fiber optic cable in telecommunications. And so material substitution is already happening. And if we invest in it, we can make it go faster. Essential uses. So this is a really important part of the pie, and I'm not sure this is really well understood, which is that when these metals are mined, they go to a lot of places. And the slice of the metals that's actually going into climate-related technologies, like electric vehicles and wind turbines, is actually pretty small. And so despite the enormous amount of attention that these clean energy technologies get in the national dialogue, it's really a fraction of the overall use. It's more likely that newly mined copper will end up in a building or in a string of holiday lights than in a wind turbine. And so what this means is that if climate uses of these metals is truly the concern, and I think we agree that it should be, at least I agree, then one option before us is to actually divert the needed metals away from less essential uses. This sounds radical, but it's actually not that radical an idea. Americans have done this many times before. I mean, the iconic example, of course, is people know the story of the role that the Iron Range played in winning World War II, and that is because we diverted those uses into something that we all deemed was essential. But a less dramatic example of that could be done by regulation, by subsidies, by tax preferences. We have a lot of policy vehicles available that, frankly, we already use to do things like the tax credit for electric vehicles tends to give a preference to domestically manufactured vehicles, right? That's a policy preference. We can use these kinds of strategies in order to encourage diversion to essential uses. Last, but certainly not least, we could consume less in general. And we can do this not only as individuals, which is certainly always a good choice, but we can think about societal choices here. Maybe we don't need to substitute every single internal combustion engine with an electric vehicle. Maybe we focus on building out our cities in a way that makes it easier to walk, bike, use mass transit. Of course, some people will still need to buy and own cars, and that's reasonable. But of course, there are also ways that we can use our public policy to make it easier for people who don't want to own a car or would find it unaffordable. Investing in public transportation can happen alongside the electric vehicle transition and also minimize its impact on metals demand. All right, so that's my first strategy, is finding metals for clean energy with different strategies. Secondly, knowing that it's possible that even after we deploy all of these strategies, we may need to still build some mines after we maximize them, we want to make sure that we have strong standards in place. And I've just described in talking about the deficiencies of the polymet permitting process, Minnesota has some work to do. Now that we've identified the series of weaknesses, it's time to fix them. We haven't actually updated our laws on sulfide mining in Minnesota since 1993. And we've learned a lot about the risks of sulfide mining since then. We know a lot more about good practices. So I don't have time to go into all of the identified and proposed changes. My organization has 10 on our website, just as a starting point, ideas that we believe are lessons learned from this first permitting process that we went through with Polymet. These include things like improved dam safety. So for example, we could have an independent inspector come and look at these mining tailings dams in order to certify whether they are safe or whether there are concerns, somebody other than the mining company themselves. We need stronger financial assurance or damage deposit laws. So this is the law that requires that mining companies put money down at the beginning of the process to ensure that there's an accident or the company goes bankrupt or the material that they're mining takes a dive in the market and the company walks away. The taxpayers are not on the hook for the costs associated with cleanup and closure of that mine. Give DNR the authority to regulate mining. Our regulations that were passed in 1993 are shockingly weak. They're vague, and they have a lot of agency discretion. What that means is that there's a lot of situations in the rule where the DNR can decide how strong they want the rule to be. And what this does is it opens the door to the mining industry, pressuring them to taking weak interpretations instead of strong ones. So let's strengthen those rules so the DNR has the authority and the mandate to regulate the way they should. Third and finally, let's talk globally. Are there ways that the mining industry can do better on a global scale? There are groups working on international mining standards. One of the problems we have right now is that mining operations do the bare minimum of the jurisdiction in which they operate, and that can be quite low. Mining companies also tend to lobby to lower those standards even further in jurisdictions where they want to operate. And in some circumstances, they will offer bribery or other corrupt practices. And as long as that's how the industry operates, no jurisdiction is safe. Instead, mining companies should commit to international standards that create a floor no matter where they operate. The Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance is a name that I have up there. This is a good start. So this is a set of guidelines. It's actually hundreds of pages. And it was created in a 10-year process. It took them 10 years to write these. And that process included mining companies. It included mining investors. It included environmental organizations. Also included mining engineers and scientists. I mean, imagine this in our current polarized environment, bringing all of these people to the table and finding a consensus over the best practices for mines. But that's what they did. If all mining companies were to commit to these international standards, we could be having a very different conversation about where and when mining happens. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Yeah. Do you want one of these waters? Do you want? Okay.
You want to raise your hand if you have a question?
I know.
They gave us comfy chairs.
Yeah, we're going to lounge.
Thank you. Could you explain what sulfide mining is? You talked about sulfide.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry. Good question. So sulfide mining is, I'm using the term, it's a wide range of metals, but what they have in common is they're embedded with a sulfide ore. And so that sulfide ore is the type that tends to go acidic. So this is in contrast to iron mining, which tends to be embedded in oxide ore. So oxide ore, that rock, you dig it up, you expose it to the air and water, you get rust. With sulfide ore, you dig it up, you expose it to air and water, and you're more likely to get acid. So it can include copper, gold, palladium, platinum, nickel, a whole range of different sort of target minerals, but that's what they have in common, is that the sulfide content.
So what he had asked is if it's part of the process or if it's part of what comes out of the ground. So that, when I mentioned 2 billion years ago, we had the great oxidation event that created our iron range and created the iron oxides, as she mentioned. And the 1 billion years ago, when the continent tried to split itself apart and the magma came up, it melted the rock, took sulfide out of the rock that was already there, and created copper and nickel sulfides. So it's actually the mineral structure of the ore has sulfides connected with it. So that's why the ore types are totally different. She's right. It completely requires a different way of managing the rock. It's not like iron mining. It requires keeping air and water out, and that's a huge challenge. And she's dead on. We cannot manage those mines the way we manage the iron mines.
Hi. Part of a comment and a question too is okay, it's part of a comment but a question as well. We have legally permitted mining going on in northern Minnesota right now that we can't control the waste from. Just a simple example is the Dunka Creek going into Birch Lake that was recently poisoned or impaired. How do you propose to sell strengthening environmental laws right now to clean up what we've already got before we start layering another completely mysterious system on top of Minnesota waters?
I am so glad you asked about Dunka, because Dunka was one of the first projects I worked on as a consultant. Dunka is worst case scenario. So if you're familiar with, so Dunca Mine was part of the LTV mine back in the days. It operated from 64 to 94. And what happened is the iron ore body is actually under the sulfide body. So it's a place where the two ore bodies overlap. And back in the old days, they went through to get to that taconite, and they took the Duluth complex material, the high sulfide stuff that we're concerned about, and they dumped it into a wetland. It is the stuff that the mining companies would process and get copper and nickel and everything out of. They dumped 50 million tons of Duluth complex rocks into a wetland. And yes, it became a huge problem, huge water quality issue. Bob's Bay of Birch Lake had massive inputs of copper, nickel, zinc, cobalt, all of those things that you do not want going into Birch Lake. It is worst case scenario. Hard stop. That was done before regulations, before people were paying attention. It's exactly the reason that Kathryn probably does what she does, so that people don't do things like that. It was terrible, and there's no other way around it, but it did not cause death and destruction. It has water treatment systems now. It has wetland treatment systems. It does, sir. I have spent a lot of time at that facility. It is worst case. That is the material that we would mine and process and take the copper, nickel, cobalt, and turn into things. But it was terrible decision making. It's why we have to have things like the Clean Water Act. It's why we have to have watchdogs. It's why we have to have environmental regulations. But it's not, there's leopard frogs there, and they have the right amount of legs, and there are critters there, and the water's being treated now. But it is a great example of why you wouldn't just do things casually. And it's one of the reasons that I got into mining, because that was one of my first projects. And I will give you a chance to also respond to that. Sorry.
I actually don't have anything to add particularly. I mean, I think going to the second piece, and I don't know if this is out of line, but I genuinely would like to know, I mean, one of the huge challenges here is the longevity of pollution at these sites. I mean, I sometimes think about how different these conversations are that we'd be having if we had better examples of these mines where it had, operated for 20 years, and for 20 years people had jobs, there was economic investment, and then there was a walk-away scenario where the mining company said, look, we're done, here's your site back, it's clean. Maybe it looks different. Maybe there's a pit where there was, a lake, where there was a field, or maybe there's a hill where there was a forest, but it's a usable site that then can be used for development or recreation or whatever the town wants. How do we get there? How do we get to the place where the cleanup can happen at the end of these operations? Because this just seems like the big historic challenge.
Well, and that's what we're seeing. Dunca is a great example because, like I said, that's where they took material that we would mine, but it was a waste material to them. They wanted the taconite. The Duluth complex stuff in the 60s and the 90s, that wasn't something they were going to process. And nowadays, mining companies are probably like, give me that. That seems like great ore. And you're right. How do we get to that point? How do we have these conversations better? How do we... I hate how these conversations are had because we're not having the right ones. You and I aren't sitting in a room saying, here's what I'm scared of. Here's what this is. Here's what that is. We're not doing that. And the problem is we don't have a mind started right now to even get to a final point. And no one else is us, right? Michigan, they have Eagle Mine, but that's not us. That's not our water. That's not our setting. Morenci, that's dry as a bone.
But you can see why no one wants to be the first, right?
Yeah.
No.
Absolutely. I had breast cancer in 2020, and then they told me, here's your chemo plan. I would not want to have been so we're going to poison you, and that's going to save your life. Who's going to sign up for that? Who's going to sign up for, we're just going to do this treatment. Just trust us. That's a scary and so I get that fear of the unknown, that fear of being the first. It's a hard one. That's why we have these.
I sat through the Minnesota high school hockey tournament, watched it, endless advertisements from new endless advertisements from New Range. And so when you say that their operations have been stopped because of all of the problems, it doesn't seem like when the state has said no, they accept no. They continue with their operations. I'm concerned about that. I wish you would have had a picture of Norilsk nickel mining so that people could see the destruction that could take place if nickel was allowed to be mined in northern Minnesota. But when will they accept no?
I don't know. I wish I knew. People have been asking me this question for a long time. And I think I want to, I appreciate your comment, and I just want to I want to offer a gentle correction, which is that, in fact, the state has never said no to PolyMet or to New Range. They have said yes, and it was the courts that said no. And that's why the three branches of government is a good thing, because in this case, it's clear that we had state agencies that very much wanted to get to yes, to the point where they were willing to bend the rules and to hide the concerns of the federal government. And we needed courts to correct that. At this point, my expectation is that the final nail in the coffin will come sometime in the next couple of weeks, when our state DNR may actually be forced to admit that this mine, as it's currently proposed and designed, cannot go forward under state law, because they have a decision pending before them on that, and an outside law judge has said that, and PolyMet themselves at this point has hinted that they know they have to reconsider their mining operation. But that's not the end. I think they've recently got a joint venture with a Canadian company called Teck. I would expect them to regroup and come back with some sort of new proposal within 3 to 5 years. Maybe less, I don't know. That's just a guess on my part. All of that said, the one sort of heartening thing I take away from this is that these court decisions that the court has made, where they are saying we have high standards in Minnesota, those court decisions are still precedent. They're still binding, and future mining operations will have to abide with those as well. And that's a good thing. It's not the same as the proposals going away, though.
And no, we'll wait. I can't speak on behalf of New Range, because I just more generally, mining Minnesota is the industry as a whole, and so I won't speak to that, because you've been in those lawsuits and I haven't. So there we go. But you bring up Norilsk and the nickel we get from there in Russia. If folks aren't familiar with Norilsk, and you want the state to say no. You want us to not provide nickel, because Norilsk is terrifying. Just Google it. But once again, we're gonna get the nickel from somewhere to build. It's in our stainless steel. It's in my wedding ring. It's in all these products. So I feel like what you're saying is I'm okay with it coming from places like that, and I don't want it coming from Minnesota, even if a project gets reevaluated. And I know that's not what you mean. I know you're not comfortable with getting your products from Russia, but that's how those questions come across, and we say mining's not good enough for us to do. Who is it good enough? Why is it good enough for others? Secretary General of UN, Antonio Guterres, just said the other day that clean energy can't come basically on the backs of the poor people in the world. So if it's not good enough for us Minnesotans, why is it good enough for someone else? We talk about environmental justice. We have to mean it, because we're really privileged Americans.
I hear you. And The companies that are the primary investors for the companies that are members of Mining Minnesota are by and large international companies. They're the same companies engaged in those mining practices elsewhere.
But not necessarily, you know, I mean, yes, technically they are the same. But we say that these mining companies are bad everywhere. Are they really bad everywhere? It can't be a blanket statement they are bad everywhere, because then that means every product we use is bad. And then is that what we're saying? That everything that we use for metals is coming from a just terrible place? There has to be good examples. You know, you talk about IRMA, and IRMA's getting going, and there's ICMM, which I screw up that acronym every time. How do we raise those standards so it's not, so that we do feel, I want to feel good about the stuff I use. You know, it's just like I feel good about domestic steel because I know the improvements we're making on the Iron Range. And I say improvements because when I started in the industry, things are improving.
So, sorry, people have questions. So
Yeah.
maybe I should stop because I want to keep on this conversation, but I want to hear from people.
Thank you both for being here, and thank you to Rosenmeier for bringing in two very knowledgeable and articulate speakers. I feel like I really know more, so thank you for that. However, my mind has not changed. Julie, I so appreciate your passion for water, and there you are at the table, but you're not at the head of the table. When it comes down to it, these companies don't have our best interest in mind, and if it's, you know, digging sulfides or the boundary waters, I know what my choice is. And I think these companies make a lot of promises, and the state has a lot of good intentions, but they're promises you can't keep. This is not a good idea.
I wish every single one of you could have done my job once. Working as an environmental manager was the hardest job ever. 24/7, 365, trying to change a culture, trying to change an operation. I know you don't trust mining, and I'm not going to ask you to. I'm also not going to ask you to not use things that come from mining, because we do that. Building that trust in corporations, that's a challenge. And we do that with every corporation, whether it's the clothing we wear, whether it's who we get our energy from, who we get our food from. We had a great discussion over dinner about food. Turns out we have almost another thing in common. I'm a pescatarian, not a vegetarian, but I'm close. Because my dad owned a meat processing plant when I was growing up in Kettle River.
That would make one a vegetarian.
That one would make one a vegetarian.
Yeah.
And you know, we talked about corporate food, and we talked about all those things. All I'm going to say is I don't blame you for feeling that way. My perspective is having been at the table with the CEO of companies and making decisions, but I can't put that experience into your being. So thank you. I respect your opinion.
Let's approach this from a different perspective. You can have all the regulations, and you can have them carried out, and everybody's being good boys and girls. Everything is beautiful. You can consume as much as you want, but the beast is in your head. It's your creativity. Because somebody has a bright idea about creating something. Back in 1948, 49, Charles Lindbergh wrote a little article and a small book. And he was talking about creativity on the loose, creating all of these things, all these little gadgets and all of this stuff. And I can remember sitting in a foxhole in the jungle transmitting on a microwave transmitter that would be your cell phone. Of course, mine was a little bit bigger and transmitting microwave 30 miles to another microwave transmitter. And now those transmitters are transmitting all over. Everybody has a cell phone. So the technology from 1963, when I was 18, to now that I'm going to turn 80, has created a lot of problems for the environment. And how do you use your brain to control consumerism? Everybody drives a car, but nobody wants to go on light rail. If you go from Bucharest to Berlin on a train, you don't have a problem. I don't have to watch out for somebody who's high on fentanyl or drunk. I just ride the train and hope it doesn't go off the rail, that's all. But the problem is we have to create a way of life that's a lot different than we're living now. We have to learn to control our creativity, but who wants to do that? So creativity has a lot of things. People invent stuff, and they need raw materials. And those raw materials are copper, whatever you need. Magnesium, you know, where you can get it. Helium, where's helium now? Helium is in Minnesota. What do we need helium? So people can get high, but you don't need to use that to get high because you can use marijuana. It's legal. In 1965, if somebody would come up with that idea, you know?
Okay.
There, I'm done.
No question? Okay. In fairness,
We have
I
one
think
right
the
here.
helium is important for MRIs as well.
Yes.
Not just getting high.
Thank you both for being here. I have an actual question. Very specific question for Julie about those graphs that you showed in your presentation, the one that showed the precious metal usage in different forms of energy and then vehicles. Are those publicly available, and where could we find them?
If you search for International Energy Agency and I can't remember what the title of the thing is, but if you do International Energy Agency and Critical Minerals, that should bring you to their report.
Okay.
And you know, I love what you brought up about substitution, and we're going to have to get innovative. There's 8 billion people, 8 billion right now, right?
Yeah.
There's 8 billion people, almost 1 billion don't have energy. People are struggling with clean water. These minerals aren't found everywhere. You know, innovation and creativity, and we're going to have, these are finite resources. You're right, there are ways we have to keep thinking.
One of you mentioned that you assume that a lot of us may have come here in electric vehicles. Not the case because we don't have the charging infrastructure here, but a lot of us do drive hybrids. Do you happen to know the comparison between traditional gas vehicle versus hybrid versus electric?
I don't know off the top of my head. I know it's more, but it's not as much.
Yeah.
Have you seen?
I have seen, but I couldn't quote the numbers. It is in between.
Yeah.
More than internal combustion engine, less than a full-on, because the battery is much smaller.
Okay. Okay. I was surprised when you mentioned that Minnesota has palladium and platinum within the mining sphere. I don't know if it's currently being mined. I live half-time in Montana, half-time in Minnesota. And in Montana, that was the first I knew of palladium mining. And when you're talking substitution, my first question has to do, we were told in Montana that palladium and platinum are being mined together because they're essential ingredients for the tech world. And when you're talking substitution, is there any substitution for palladium-platinum combination? And then my second question is, where is this being mined, or where is this located in Minnesota?
So it is part of the copper-nickel deposit. It's also just found in those deposits. So the exact same ones also have platinum and palladium. I'm sure there's substitutes. Platinum and palladium, have been used in catalytic converters, which won't be needed with electric vehicles. But crazy enough, platinum and palladium are actually used in chemotherapies too, which I don't know how scientists figure out some of the stuff they do. Like, I don't even know why you would even think of trying that. but that is another use of it.
Yeah, I don't know what the substitutions are. It tends to be, a lot of that material substitution tends to be market driven. And so, the greater the scarcity, the higher the cost. Cobalt is a great example, right? So cobalt, if you really want to hear a horrific mining story, look up cobalt. The vast majority of the world's cobalt reserves are in the Congo, in Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that's a very uncontrolled situation. You've got children, you've got people mining on their own in unprotected situations, and so a consortium of international companies, including some electric vehicle companies, got together to figure out how do we get the cobalt out of our batteries. And I can't remember the name of the consortium. Maybe it's something like the Better Cobalt Consortium or something like that. But it's basically to say, how do we either fix this problem, like improve things in the Congo, or just shift away from this material entirely? And it's really been, as far as I know, fairly successful actually in the latter. Far fewer electric vehicle batteries that you buy today have cobalt than did 5 years ago.
I am going to bounce back a couple questions. I apologize. But I just wanted to bounce off what this gentleman said. I do completely agree that these corporations are very much profit-based. They are. Everybody wants to make money. You do, of course. We're a capitalist society. That's how it's going to work. However, they are not cruelty-based. The goal is not to destroy the environment. If it were more affordable to be more environmentally friendly, companies would jump right on that train. Absolutely, if that would bring in more profit. What would be your suggestion to make those processes that we already have more affordable for those companies so that they would be more practical? I apologize, I stutter.
We need a premium on responsibly sourced. My husband's a steel worker, and I look at his contract and what it has in it and what our health insurance is, or I look at the iron we mined and what things go into that. And the U.S. has dealt with steel dumping, where steel's coming in from China and other countries. Our steel should cost more, but we should also be willing to pay more because of the reasons it costs more. And so the U.S. tried to do with domestic production of electric vehicles a different rebate system based on domestically mined minerals, so that if you buy a car with domestically mined minerals, you get a different rebate than if it's coming from somewhere else like the Congo. And as consumers, are we willing to do that? Are we willing to pay a premium? Because I do think that's where some of it comes in. What do we do?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I do think that, the reason this Cobalt Consortium came about was because these companies were worried about consumer backlash, right? So as consumers, we do have some power here to put pressure on companies to do better. Another classic example would be you remember the film Blood Diamond, right? Like that changed the diamond industry. I can probably have a debate about whether it's better now or not, but it is different. And that was an important moment where people kind of understood, hey, wait a second, maybe this has a problematic history. So that transparency in the supply chain and that public pressure is helpful. At the end of the day, though, the regulatory structure has to be in place so that companies find this on their own, I think, in a lot of ways. The greatest successes of environmental laws historically have been the laws that set the standard for where we want to get without telling the companies how to get there, okay? So the classic example is the Clean Water Act. When the Clean Water Act was first passed, if you'll just beg my indulgence for a moment, the first time it was passed with what were called technology-based effluent limits. Basically said, look, whatever the best technology available we have, use that and try to make the water clean. It didn't take long before we realized that didn't work, because the technology wasn't really there. And so there was still a lot of polluted water going into our waterways. And so in the revision, this was 1981, I think, was the new Federal Clean Water Act, focused on water quality-based effluent limits. It said, okay, here's the water that you can discharge, and it can't have any more of this pollutant or that pollutant. Like, we're going to put limits on what you can discharge. How you get there, companies, that's up to you. So maybe you want to change your processes, maybe you want to look at different inputs, maybe you want to create a circular system in your factory so you're not actually discharging the water, you're reusing it in some way. Maybe you're transferring it into a solid through a cleaning process, whatever. That's your business, right? Because you're in the business of doing this, and probably the assumption was, and I think it's probably correct, that the companies were going to be better equipped to figure out how to get there. So the government's saying how clean, and the company is saying how. And that's how environmental regulations, I think that's when they're most successful. And so in a circumstance like this, I don't know that you can make it profitable to respect the environment, but you can put the guardrails in place so that the companies figure out the most efficient way to get there.
Being here, Julie and Kathryn, very much appreciate it. Julie, during your presentation, you talked about how you don't feel good about some of the mining practices around the globe, that there's potentially some bad actors and bad mining practices. And you just mentioned responsibly sourced for our metals and our minerals. Here's where I struggle. I didn't know much about twin metals. While I've been sitting here, I did a quick Google search, learned that Antofagasta is the parent company. It's a Chilean company. When I Googled that company, the first thing that came up was an article today from Mining Magazine that cites that Antofagasta was fined $695,000 for unauthorized extraction of surface and groundwater and for not complying with water distribution rules and in a water scarcity zone. So that's where I struggle. Twin Metals is some type of a subsidiary of that company. So how, as a Minnesotan, do I feel good about Twin Metals and your practices here in Minnesota when your parent company, if this is accurate, this media that I just read today, if that's the parent company, how do I reconcile that and feel good about what you might do here in Minnesota?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I haven't seen that article yet today, so I can't speak to that article. And as Kathryn mentioned, we have, the mining projects, the investors and the corporations are from other countries. And, it's different from the iron mining where, U.S. Steel and Cleveland Cliffs are obviously by the name American companies. And, I always try to wrestle, I always wrestle with that too. And I don't have a set answer for that. When I look at it, I think, okay, we have our Minnesota regulations, we have our Minnesota regulators, we have our Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, but they are those foreign companies. And, really that's what it comes back to for me is to look at what we have in place, because the permits are the same, the regulations are the same, whether you're from Chile or Cleveland. But that's not a satisfying answer, and I understand that. And like I said, I would love to give you a more satisfying answer, but I'm not going to whitewash it or try to cover it up. I look at companies and how we hold them accountable. The biggest Clean Air Act violation was just in the last year, and it was for Cummins, which is a U.S. company, and they got fined over $1 billion for falsifying their vehicle records, and Dodge Rams are having this massive recall, and that never made the news. And it's an American company, and we have to hold companies accountable. We have to have regulations. I don't know that American companies are any inherently less prone to things. And we just, I have to look at the article. It's disappointing to hear that. And I'm sure there's probably more to it. I've learned in having had the roles I had that sometimes there's always two sides, but I recognize that struggle.
So last year I went on a delegation with a group of other folks from my organization, from MCEA, to Honduras. And we visited some mining operations in Honduras. All of them had connections to U.S. companies. And, you know, the people that were living there had been exploited. They were, in some cases, had their homes, essentially taken away from them by the way the mining pit expanded. In one case, an ancestral graveyard that was 200 years old in that community had been dug up and moved without the community's permission, which was a really terrible thing for that community. And they were also suffering violence at the hands of probably Honduran police, or at least people in Honduran police uniforms, over when they tried to defend their water. And, nobody in Honduras said, gee, we sure wish you'd mine in Minnesota so that our lives will get better, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense. They were saying, don't let this happen to your communities. But they were also saying, and this is sort of where I want to get to, is that, and they challenged us a little bit, and they said, what are you going to do with the fact that you're US citizens? How are you going to help us? As US citizens, we think of ourselves as being relatively powerless, right? Like, you just get one vote, right? None of us is going to decide probably any election anytime soon, except for, maybe a few of us might get lucky on like a county commissioner. Sometimes those are real close. We don't think of ourselves as being powerful, but, we can contact our representatives. We can call up our senators. As the leader of a nonprofit, I can probably even get a meeting with those people if I really wanted it. We can even contact our president. We can tell those people what we think. And the people of Honduras can't do that. And so I think one thing that we can do as U.S. citizens, and I don't disagree with Julie, I'm not sure that U.S. companies are better than worse than any other companies. I don't think that's the right frame. But I do think that when we think about, are there companies that want to operate in the United States, that is a lever that we can use to improve the lives of people in Honduras. We can put pressure on our representatives and our senators and on those companies to say, hey, you want to operate here, you do better in other places. You prove to us that you are an ethical and responsible company, and then let's talk about doing business.
It's, I live, like I said, on the Iron Range. I'm a township supervisor. Does that, you
but I had a very close election.
I won by a decent amount, but
I believe
it's,
you.
But, and we haven't had a chance to talk about communities really tonight and what the impacts of a community are and what obligations companies have to those communities. One of our challenges in copper nickel mining is there are no domestic copper nickel mining companies. The Eagle mine is run by Lundin out of Canada, and the copper mining in the Southwest is an American company, but they want nothing to do with nickel. They're like, we know how to process copper, we don't touch nickel. So we don't have American companies that have that expertise. And so that's a challenge too. But it is, how do we have those standards? I've worked for a foreign mining company twice now. I worked for ArcelorMittal, which was out of London and Luxembourg. And I did work for Antofagasta, because as my bio said, I work for Twin Metals. And when I worked there, and I, like I said, I try not to speak, so in this case I'm speaking just on behalf of myself as an employee, I know we were held to tight standards on what our project would be. I never felt I was working for a Chilean mining company that did anything less than was required in the US. But once again, I have no way of putting you at that table with me when we developed our plans. I wish I could. I really wish I could. I don't have a way. One thing I would love to say, though, is that sometimes when we demonize the mining industry, that next generation of mining people that care about the earth, the last thing they're gonna be like, they don't want to be like me sitting on that airplane not willing to say what they do for a living. Like, we have to make it where the next generation of people who care about the environment are willing to go into the industry that most affects the environment, so that you have people at the table making the decisions that can make the decisions in the right way.
827.
Oh.
Does money win?
Hilarious.
There's a great deal of money up in that area. And how do you fight that when you have a unique area, the boundary water canoe area, that wilderness area? I've canoed that area, and it's maybe one of the unique areas in the entire world. I don't know if there's anything quite like that. And so you put those two things together, that money seldom loses, and you have a wilderness area that's totally unique and a value that's intrinsic. And where's the money to protect the, are we going to all, use our savings to make sure that it has the equal amount of money to fight the mining companies that have incredible amounts of money? I don't know. Is there any hope that in this case that money doesn't win and that we'll lose one of the unique environments in all the world, the wilderness area of the Minnesota border that goes into Canada, that canoe area, lakes and pure water? I don't know. I'd like to be hopeful.
Money often wins. People also win. Did my battery die?
Oh,
no, you can hear me now. Money often wins. People also win. Politicians are people too, and there are a lot of politicians in the United States, elected officials, who also love the boundary waters. And there are proposals happening now to protect the boundary waters, right? There are proposals this is already decided, to withdraw all of the federal mineral interests from that watershed so that they don't go up for auction and they can't be mined in the future, and even to take Twin Metals leases away from them so that that goes back to the federal government. I do think durable protections are possible in particular areas. And I'm hopeful that will happen. And I've been fighting, what feels like the same mine for 14 years. And I'm still hopeful. Yeah. And I guess that's all I'm going to say.
Question?
A little bit more of a comment. You had mentioned money always wins. There is plenty of money on the other side as well. And then using the courts and lawsuits has most definitely tied this project up for a long time, specifically the Polymet project. It at one time had all of its permits, and it's been trying to get a process going for 20 years now. So there are definitely avenues on the other side. And I'm an Iron Ranger. I'm from the Iron Range. I live in Chisholm. I've worked at almost all of the taconite mines on the range. I'm excited for future projects like this to go forward. And the main thing is we too don't want to ruin our water. We too do not want to ruin what we have around us. We live there. That's our backyard specifically. We play there. We live there. We love it. We also don't want to lose it. So I want to, thank both panelists for coming up, or speakers for coming up and presenting. I really appreciate the transparency, Julie, about the companies aren't perfect on the mining industry around the world. They aren't. I do believe we have a real chance to make a difference by being a pioneer in this area and being the first. Like I said, we don't want to ruin our own backyard. We want to make it right. We want to do it right. We want to be a contributor to these renewables and stuff, working in the construction field myself. We love construction. We want to put up your wind turbines. We want to put your solar fields out there. We also want to provide the materials that build those. So with that, thank you again for your guys' time. I appreciate it.
I want to say thank you. Yeah. Thank you to everybody for coming. I think we're a little bit over time, so we'll say good night. Thank you to Julie and to Kathryn, and thanks so much for the great discussion.
It was really great to meet you.
Really enjoyable. Thank you.
That was fun.